Billy Blue, my knight in shining brindle. Welcome to another episode of A Poet Reads to Write. Today I would like to take part in a wonderful original BookTube tag that is the brainchild of Daniela at Uncommon Reader. This is a wonderful tag that she has called the Books and Art tag. And this is a wonderful tag that she has created to celebrate her first anniversary on BookTube. And discovering Danielle's channel has just been fantastic for me. It's a wonderful channel. So if you don't know Uncommon Reader, I would really recommend that you check it out, and I will link to Daniela's channel down below. All right, let's get into it because there are 9 prompts. So let's get into it so this doesn't get too long. What Daniela has done here with these 9 prompts is to start each prompt with a great work of art and to see what books can be triggered by the association with that artwork. Her first prompt is The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog by Caspar David Friedrich. That wonderful romantic painting of the solitary male artist, up in a mountaintop, surveying, if you like, purviewing the sublime. It's a marvelous painting. And for Daniela, this triggered the theme of solitude. So what do we have? For me, in the Australian art, what I've decided to do with this, to add a little twist to it, all the books that I'm going to feature in this video are themselves art books. So I'm using Daniela's prompt and her associative theme, if you like, to trigger off associations with different artworks that mean a lot to me. In Australia, there is a wonderful mid-20th century Australian painter who really epitomizes solitude. My goodness. The painter is a wonderful bloke called Ian Fairweather. He was actually a Scotsman, but he really reacted against that strict, very judgmental Presbyterian Calvinist faith. And as a young adult, he basically fled Scotland and couldn't get far enough away. In the 1930s, he spent almost 10 years living in China, and he absolutely loved China. While he was living in China, he studied very deeply Eastern calligraphy, and he just absolutely loved it. And he learnt, Cantonese and Mandarin, and he spent a lot of time also translating. He was one of the first great translators of Chinese Buddhist texts into English. He's a really interesting bloke, completely self-taught. He spent a short time in Scotland, in London at art schools, but never did very much, never excelled. He lived his whole life very much in solitude. He was very much an artist. He gave himself over completely to his artistic practice. He spent his whole life somehow, doing just enough work to feed himself and to clothe himself and to find some type of shelter. Usually his shelters were literally self-made hovels that he lived in. He somehow made ends meet, and he lived to be this fantastic artist. So he spent about 10 years in China, between sort of Shanghai and Peking, learning, as I said, quite a few Chinese languages. He became a great translator of Chinese Buddhism into English, and he studied very deeply Eastern calligraphy. He just loved it. And you will see in his art practice that fusion, if you like, of the Chinese or the Eastern calligraphy with Western drawing practices. Really interesting. This is the great monograph, the great artwork on Ian Fairweather. This is the great work by an Australian novelist and art critic called Murray Baal. This is an absolutely gem of a book, really richly illustrated, full, beautiful colour photographs of the artworks on art paper. Murray Baal, as I said, was also, as well as being an art critic, and he is a huge lover of the work, of course, of Ian Fairweather, but he was also a novelist. This is probably his most famous novel in Australia. In terms of readers of Australian literary fiction, I don't think there would be anyone who wouldn't have this novel as one of their top 10 picks. It's a beautiful book. This is a sort of a modern retelling of that folktale tradition. This is a beautiful book called Eucalyptus. It tells the story of this quirky, oddball father who retreats to the Australian outback where he buys a huge property, and over years and years he walks this property planting trees. He's a wonderful naturalist, and he plants, in particular, he falls in love with the eucalyptus, or the gum tree, which is of course a hybrid. There's such an ancient tree in Australia that there are hundreds and hundreds of different species of this tree as it hybridizes and is constantly inventing, if you like, by itself, new species of tree. What he does in this quirky, oddball father, he has a beautiful young daughter, and when the daughter turns 19, he announces to the world that whoever can walk with him his property, walk with him the whole property, and whoever can name every species of tree on his property, this beautiful eucalyptus species, hundreds and hundreds of them. Whoever can walk with him along this property, naming each tree correctly, can win the hand of his beautiful daughter in marriage. So it's this incredible modern retelling of this classic folktale type, motif. And of course, the story turns out to be, of course, the daughter, Ellen, really is a coming of age story, as she asserts her own bodily autonomy and grows into emotional maturity. And of course, it is her, in the end, who chooses which suitor she wants to marry, the young man who she falls in love with. It's the most unexpected, beautiful story, absolutely majestic. One of the great all-time literary works of fiction in Australia, Eucalyptus by Murray Baal. But what it's all about today is Murray Baal's beautiful big monograph on Ian Fairweather. Oh boy, you can see from that, that's the sort of painting that Ian Fairweather, I guess, is most known for. Here's a work, I don't know whether you're going to be able to see this. There's a photograph of the man. That's in one of the hovels that he literally built out of, thrown away materials. He lived on an island just off Brisbane coast for many years, at the end of his life. And he lived, in poverty on this island, just painting. And that's in that hovel. You can see some paintings that he's working on at the moment. He was just such a quirky, interesting bloke. Look at this. Just incredible paintings. Astounding. I guess, he almost went to abstraction, but he was an amazing colorist, and he never quite got over the form, I guess. So there are aspects of his that are also figurative, but you can really see in paintings like this, can't you? You can really see the influence of Eastern calligraphy meets Western drawing practice. He's an astounding artist. I just love him to bits. I've also got this print, this beautiful thing that I live with in my home. He is one of my top Australian artists. Such an interesting guy. Fled Scotland as a young man, 10 years or so in China, living between Peking and Shanghai, learning different Chinese languages, translating Chinese Buddhism into English, learning Eastern calligraphy, and bringing all of that to bear on his own art practice. So he eventually came to Australia, lived in hovels in complete solitude and poverty. He was just completely given over to the practice of art. Unfortunately, He's a conservator's nightmare. He was so poor, sold very few paintings in his lifetime. So literally many of these incredible works of art are painted on newspaper. You know, when he could afford it, he had cheap canvas, but often his paintings were literally on newspaper. You can imagine the conservator's nightmare of trying to keep these things in as good a property as possible, because now, of course, Ian Fairweather in Australia is one of the most loved of our mid-20th century artists. His paintings now are worth an absolute fortune, and many of them are just painted on newspaper. Oh boy. All right, prompt 2. We've done Solitude, Ian Fairweather. Prompt 2, Cherubs by Raphael, the supernatural protagonist. Oh boy. I don't suppose any artists are truly a supernatural protagonist, but my goodness, if there was one artist who you could argue was somehow sent to us from outer space, you know, if there was one great visitor from a distant planet who came to these shores, the supernatural protagonist personified, for me, it would have to be Mark Rothko. This is the incredible work by Rothko's own son, you know, Mark Rothko, From the Inside Out. It's a wonderful read, pretty heavy going mostly, but, you know, it's quite a good book. There's a photograph of the man. Mark Rothko, of course, that, you know, middle 20th century painter right at the beginnings of abstraction and modernism. Boy, you know, modernism, I suppose abstraction in the beginnings, you know, in the mid-20th century milieu, it really was divided, wasn't it, into the action school, personified by someone like Jackson Pollock, and the colour-filled, more meditative field, which of course is personified by someone like Mark Rothko. He did the, you know, the wonderful Rothko chapel paintings in Houston, in the US. He's a marvellous painter, that colour-filled painter that seemed to radiate with meditative qualities, you know. He really does, I think, personify the supernatural protagonist in the art world. He's an astounding painter. This is the classic biography, I guess, of Rothko by James Breslin. Another wonderful photo of the man. This is, as I said, the great art biography of him. James Breslin's an interesting bloke. He's done a lot of work. He's actually an art or poetry critic. He's done a lot of work on William Carlos Williams and on modernist to postmodernist poetry in the United States. But he's also branched off into some of his favourite artworks, and one, of course, is Mark Rothko. He's done this great award-winning biography. It's an interesting biography, you know, it's beautifully written, unbelievably detailed. You can see it. It's an incredibly long thing. It is a big chunker to read. It's beautifully written, incredibly detailed. It is one of these biographies that thinks you can somehow understand a life simply by retelling a series of events. I always find it interesting that, you know, so many biographers don't go into psychoanalytic type theory and really try and get at the inner subconscious, you know, particularly when you're dealing with an artist that is so known for abstract, you know, expressionism as Mark Rothko. I really think this would be really interesting to really have a go at getting into that subconscious about what was going on with the man. But, you know, that's not James Breslin's cup of tea. He just thinks, you know, if it's incredibly well researched, very detailed, you retell the series of events and you can somehow understand a person by simply relating all the things they did and said during a lifetime. I think biography should be a bit more than that, but it is a beautiful thing to read. For me, one of the great books on Rothko is this one by Jacob Baal-Teshuva. This is the great illustrated thing by Rothko. You can see again a lovely picture of the man on the front there. That's the sort of picture that he is really known for, these colour-filled abstract expressionist works that just really radiate with a real meditative depth. You know, that's the sort of art you either love or hate, I guess. I love it. Mark Rothko has always meant the world to me. And you can see I've really bought up big with this thing. This great big thing in the slipcase. It's a magnificent book, this. Just astounding. And the colour reproductions, That's an earlier work by Rothko. It's not one that we're usually associating with now. That's the more, that's the work that we really associate with the mature Rothko. Rothko was an interesting egoist in some ways. He was a great self-promoter, even though he also lived, a life quite of solitude. He got quite popular. He was very fond of saying that, the whole of world cultural history could be summarized in the 3 M's. And the 3 M's for Rothko were, of course, Mozart, Matisse, and himself as Mark. So he really did have this idea that the whole of, world culture could be summarized in those 3 male artists. It's hard to know how seriously to take it, isn't it? But he was an incredible artist. He is one of those artists as well. He had lots of falling outs with people. He was a very prickly, combative, interesting sort of person. And he went himself to begin with, from realism through, I suppose, surrealism, before he went to abstract expressionism. And his abstract expressionist practice was always this colour-filled, meditative type work. He's an incredible painter. It's hard to believe that a painter that, was known for falling out with people and had so many inner conflicts and was such a combative person in some ways, It's so interesting that he came up with his art practice that was just so much about stillness, about meditative resonance. His paintings really just radiate a depth, a solitude, that meditative quality. Very hard painter to, in some ways, describe. Here's another book I have on Rothko by Susan Grange. This is a terrific book that really does put Rothko into that 20th century, context. It's really good at looking at the movement of the young Rothko from a realist painter in his middle years when he was more influenced by things like Dada and Surrealism. And then, of course, his complete metamorphosis into this incredible abstract expressionist painter, the really meditative, colour-filled painting. It's a marvellous book, this. This is really readable as well. It really does. Susan Grange has an astounding capacity for communicating very complicated cultural, contextual ideas and make them very, very understandable. This is a very engaging, very readable work of art history, art criticism. Mark Rothko himself, of course, hated art critics, hated art criticism. He thought they always got everything wrong. I'd like to think that if Mark Rothko had have met Susan Grange, he would have loved what she did on him here. Here's another wonderful work from the back cover. This is just a fabulous book to read. Really does make things very understandable. I love it. All right. Where are we up to? Oh, I'm just trying to keep these books in some sort of order so they don't get damaged. All right, the third prompt, Moscow by Kandinsky. Oh boy, I love Kandinsky. Right there at the beginnings of abstract art. Oh, I'm a big fan of Kandinsky. And for Daniela, the theme that comes out of this Moscow by Kandinsky is the dystopic. I don't really do dystopia. I come from a very devout Protestant Christian background, and every year as a kid I was taken to watch these Left Behind genre films, and ironically they scared the living bejesus out of me. I always knew, I think, that I was going to be left behind from the rapture and have to, choose between the chopping block or the tattooed 666. So I don't do dystopia at all. It just puts me back in these horrific childhood memories of these Left Behind genre films. So the closest I can come to dystopia is Margaret Atwood. I don't read any of her dystopic classics, but she's recently just brought out this magnificent new and selected poems. Look at this, called Paper Boat. Fabulous title, isn't it, for a new and selected poetry. This is the new and selected poetry of Margaret Atwood. I thought I might read just a few, just to give you a taste of what Margaret Atwood, the poet, is capable of. And then you'll all be rushing out to buy this beautiful book. This is a small little sequence of poems she wrote on snakes. I will just read a couple. Lesson on snakes. Pinned down, this one opens its mouth as wide as it can, showing fangs and a throat like a view down a pink lily, double tongue curved out like stamens. The lilies do it to keep from being eaten, this dance of snakes, and the snakes do it to keep from being eaten also, since they cannot talk. The snake is a mute, except for the sound like steam escaping from a radiator it makes when cornered, something punctured and leaking. This one is green and yellow, striped like a moose apple. Sweetly with grace it hunts a glimpse, a rustle among the furry strawberries. It's hardly the devil in your garden, but a handy antidote to mice, and yet you'd batter it with a hoe or crossbar or twist of a slack rope. A bad answer to getting anything that gets in what you think is your way. Oh boy, what a way to end the poem, and really end it on that eco-critical note of, respecting another animal and not just judging it by what baggage we bring to its presence. It's a beautiful poem, I think. Here's another wonderful poem. Lies about snakes. I present the glass snake, which is supposed to break when stepped on, but doesn't. One more lie about snakes. Nor is it transparent. Nothing could be more opaque. Watch it there as it undulates over the sand, a movement of hips in a tight skirt. You remember the legends of snakes, which were changed to women and vice versa. Another lie. Other lies about snakes. That they cause thunder, that they won't cross ropes, that they travel in pairs, even when together for warmth at night or in winter. Snakes are alone. Swaying up from coiled baskets, they move as if to music, but snakes cannot hear music. The time they keep is their own. Oh, what a magnificent poem. That comic wit of Margaret Atwood. Beautiful poem, isn't it? This is the last poem I will read, called Bad Mouth. There are no leaf-eating snakes. All are fanged and gorged on blood. Each one is a hunter's hunter. Nothing more than an endless gullet, pulling itself on over the still alive prey, like a sock gone ravenous, like an evil glove, like sheer greed, live and devious. Puff adder buried in hot sand, or poisoning the toes of boots, for whom killing is easy and careless as war, as digestion. Why should you be spared? And you, constrictor, sinuous ribbon of true darkness, one long muscle with eyes and an anus, looping like thick tar out of the trees, to squeeze the voice from anything edible, reducing it to scales and belly. And you, pit viper, with your venomous pallid throat and teeth like syringes, and your nasty radar homing in on the deep red shadow nothing else knows it casts. Shall I concede these deaths? Between us there is no fellow feeling as witness. A snake cannot scream. Observe the alien chainmail skin, straight out of science fiction, pure shiver, pure satin. Those who can't explain them can't explain anything. Some say they're a snarled puzzle, only gasoline and a match can untangle. Even their mating is barely sexual, a romance between two lengths of cyanide-coloured string. Despite their live births and squirming nests, it's hard to believe in snakes loving. Alone among the animals, the snake does not sing. The reason for them is the same as the reason for stars, and not human. Oh boy. her ear for just the respect for other life forms, you know, for not being so human-centered for a while. Oh, I love Margaret Atwood's poetry. This has been a revelation buying this book. This is my reading experience with the wonderful Margaret Atwood. All right, where are we up to? The Cradle by Berthe Morisot, Mother and Child. Right. I'm going to return to Australia again for this one. In Australia, there was a wonderful, what's called assemblage art. She was an assemblage artist from the sort of late 20th century, called Rosalie Gascoigne. She was actually a Kiwi girl, but she married a young Australian astronomer, and they moved back to Canberra in Australia at the Stromlo Observatory, where she lived nearly her whole adult life and raised her family. In that era, she was married very young. She started having children very young. So even though she felt there was something missing in her life, apparently, she always had this sense that she wanted something more, but she never knew what it was. She never went to art schools or did any of that. She was simply a stay-at-home mum with her kids, and she gave herself her whole life to that. But then when her children got a little bit older and a little bit more independent, she discovered her one last child, her art practice. As I said, she never went to art school or anything, so she never learnt to draw. She never learnt any of those really what it's seen as so pivotal, foundational, to a great artistic practice. But to begin with, when she really started to reach out for more, to really explore her really strong and creative side, she went to Japanese ikebana, that practice of Japanese dried flower arranging. And she learned so much from the Japanese spirit of flower arranging in terms of form and color and shape. And she did that in a really advanced way for several years, really making a very intense study of ikebana. And everything she learned from that, when she finally found her way to assemblage artist, she brought that practice with her. So you can see the sort of things she did. She spent years and years going through rubbish tips, looking at side dirges and dumps and them. She would find old road signs, for example, these wonderful yellow road signs, old discarded things. And she brought them all back to her workshop, which her husband built her in the backyard. And there she could give herself to her art practice. And she got all these old road signs and crates, wooden crates that soft drinks used to be sold in, all sorts of things. She would just cut them up into these thin slivers and assemble them together to create her art. It's an astounding artistic practice. You can see where that Japanese ikebana again comes from. There's a wonderful photograph of Rosalie. Towards the end of her life, when she'd become quite a well-known Australian artist. She's now, a fabulous artist. She's absolutely adored. This is probably my favourite work of art of all time. This is an astounding assemblage art, a piece that she called Monaro. You can see that it's all these old road signs that she's sliced up. She often puts them vertically, but these ones she's placed horizontally to create this astounding field of yellow on black. The more you look at it, the more it just shimmers and changes with light, and it's an astounding work. This work is in the University of Western Australia Gallery over there in Perth. And oh my goodness, as I said, Rosalie Gascoigne is one of my favourite artists of all time, and this is probably my favourite work by her. And I never thought I would ever get to see it in the flesh. I don't really enjoy flying, and I really couldn't see how I would ever get to Perth to see this. But about 10 years ago, I came into some money from some writing projects, a big essay and some major feature-length reviews that I had written. And so I just bought a ticket on the Indian Pacific, this wonderful rail journey from Sydney to Perth. And I came back on the train as well, believe it or not. 4 days, 4 nights on this luxury train, sort of like the Orient Express. And I spent 2 weeks in Perth and Fremantle, but every day over the course of those 2 weeks, I would find myself at some stage wandering back into this art gallery in Perth and standing in front of this magnificent assemblage piece. I couldn't believe it when I was finally in the room, standing in front of this. Oh, I just spent hours looking at this. I've written some ekphrastic poetry in my current book called Cactus. There is some ekphrastic poetry about this work of art in that book. One of the highlights of my life, getting on this train and going to Perth to see Monaro. Here's just some other stuff she's done. That's the sort of thing she comes up with. The other great thing about Rosalie Gascoigne is that throughout her whole life, she was a great crossword puzzle solver. She just loved the crossword puzzle. And for Rosalie Gascoigne, she again, that's just like she brought the principles of Japanese ikebana to bear on her art practice, she also brought her great expertise as a solver of crossword puzzles, particularly cryptic crossword puzzles. She just loved them. You can see about coming into the art practice as well, can't you? It's astounding. But her titles are just fabulous. So this piece here is called Summer Divided, and this one is called Summer Swarm. And it really does, like that swarm of wasps or bees. Her titles are just incredible. She's had another one, work that's been literally come up by cutting up all bits of rubbish, putting them together, and she called it flash art. The sense of irony, the sense of occasion. Her titles are just marvelous. So, yes, one of my favorite artists of all time, Rosalie Gascoigne. Oh boy. All right, where are we up to? The Swing by Renoir. And for Daniela, this brings to mind childhood. What else? Again in Australia, like Mark Rothko, part of that, Russian Jew who was escaping the pogroms and the Nazi, so he ended up in the United States. Mora herself was very lucky not to be arrested and sent to Auschwitz. She was a French Jew who finally was able to flee the Nazis, and she finally made her way to Australia. She became a very, very well-known, much-loved Melbourne painter. I always think of Mora as being very influenced by that wonderful Russian Jewish painter Marc Chagall. There's a real joy and colour and exuberance, and she was a great painter of childhood. She had her own 3 or 4 kids, never tired of painting them and painting them with their toys. And as I said, her sense of colour, her sense of movement and exuberance, it was unbound. I love Mora. I lived in Melbourne for a few years, and the other thing Mora really did was get into mural work. And so she was commissioned to do several large-scale murals in the Melbourne CBD. And I've spent a lot of time with all of them. She's a much-loved Melbourne painter. She has recently just passed away. But she was a marvellous, marvellous woman. I just love her to bits. This is the sort of thing that she's known for. You can see the use of colour and just the exuberance, the innocence, the way she captures childhood. It's astounding, I think. Here she is with her children. You can see the lovely picture there of Mirka as a young mum, surrounded by her kids, and some of her kids on this side with their own little artistic practice. Oh, she's a marvellous woman. There's another couple of photos, one of midlife and one in her old age. She's a much, much loved Australian painter. Oh, I love Mora. Another one of this incredible Jewish experience. This is the sort of thing that she's so well known for. Never quite went to abstraction. She was a type of figurative artist, I guess. But the use of colour and exuberance, the angels, the cherubs, the way she captured childhood, the innocence of childhood. Marvellous, marvellous painter. I just love her to bits. Mora. Okay, where are we up to? American Gothic by Wood Grant. Rural Place. Okay. Again in Australia, there's a wonderful artist called Fred Williams. He passed away. He was only in his 40s when he died of a heart attack. much loved Australia, again a Victorian painter, a Melbourne boy, and he was a fabulous painter of landscapes. Many critics have said that really the only real major contribution of Australian art to world art has been in its landscapes, you know, with things like John Coburn, John Olsen, you know, those sorts of artists, so many. You know, Australia, the landscape has really been a major foundation, if you like, of the Australian art practice. And one of the best painters of landscape in Australia, who had the biggest influence on the biggest number of other artists, was Fred Williams. Just a marvellous, marvellous painter. Here's some beautiful self-portraits that he did of himself. Quite unusual for his work. As I said, he was much more a painter of landscapes. This is the sort of thing that he came up with that he's really known for. He's an astounding painter, the way he brought to bear. Here's another beautiful piece. You can see just again, like Mora, the exuberant use of colour. It's just, he's a magnificent colourist. An incredible sense of painting. He also painted some landscapes, you know, for example, of the bark of trees. And he would get up so close that they almost have the bearing of being abstract art. He's a marvellous painter, much loved Australian landscape painter. All right, where are we up to? Self-portrait of Artemisia Gentileschi, the female protagonist. Okay, I've already talked about the beginnings of abstract expressionism and how abstract expressionism can be divided into the action painting of Jackson Pollock, or of course the meditative colour-filled painting of Mark Rothko. I thought I would, for this, get to Lee Krasner and one of my great love affairs. Oh boy. In the National Gallery of Australia in Canberra, there was sort of a Jackson Pollock room. Australia, under the Prime Minister, the Labor Prime Ministership of Gough Whitlam, one of our great, most loved by progressive people, prime ministers between 1972 and 1975. While he was prime minister, he very controversially raised several $1 million to buy Jackson Pollock's monumental triptych Blue Poles, and he brought it to Canberra. It's of course now in the National Gallery there in Canberra, and there was several other works by Pollock, smaller works. And in the same room there was this work by Lee Krasner. She's known, unfortunately, as simply being Pollock's wife, but she was a fantastic artist in her own right. You know, like Mora and Mark Rothko, Marcus Ratkovich, like them, she was a European Jew fleeing the Nazis, and she also, like Mark Rothko, she found herself in the United States, became one of those really great American painters of the mid-20th century. I just love her to bits, and I must admit, I went to the Rothko, to the Jackson Pollock room, oh, Jack the Dripper. I went there to see his Blue Poles, of course. You know, that's what took me to that room. There was a young physicist who applied fractal theory to the interpretation of Jackson Pollock, and I was very excited to get to Blue Poles and look at it and to try and translate this fractal theory to a reading of the painting myself. But when I got there, you know, and I started spending time with Blue Poles, opposite Blue Poles, there were these paintings that were just mesmerizing. And the more I returned to spend time with Jackson Pollock, I found myself drifting off increasingly to Lee Krasner. She was in the same room, and oh my goodness, I just loved her stuff to bits. Again, you know, the use of color. She's an amazing colorist. I just love Lee Krasner's work. She certainly should not be only known as Jackson Pollock's wife. She was much more than that. An astounding American Jewish abstract painter. I just love her to bits. Here's one self-portrait that she did early in her career. That's a very unusual sort of painting for her. That's not her usual style. but I guess many artists begin, don't they, with more figurative, more realistic stuff. This is what the mature Lee Krasner is all about. Marvellous use of line and colour, isn't it? Breathtaking. I just love Lee Krasner. I can't get enough of it. Look at this. Oh boy. Astounding use of colour and line. Very similar, well, reminds me a lot of that, you know, work by Ian Fairweather that I love so much. I guess Lee Krasner is a little bit more abstract than Fairweather. Here's a lovely portrait of her again in her older age. It's a lovely portrait, isn't it? Very playful, very intelligent, has a great calm centre. And there's another portrait of the woman exploring the coastlines. I just love Lee Krasner. I think she's a marvellous artist. This is another book, another sort of a biographical, personal type thing by Ruth Appelhoff. Beautiful. There's another portrait of her again. Another wonderful painting by Lee Krasner. This is a wonderful thing to read. It's a very intimate sort of portrait. This done by a friend, someone who knew her well. This, I guess, is again the great biography of Lee Krasner by Gail Levin. It's a beautiful book, this. I really enjoy reading this, spending time with it. Listen to this. This is a quote from George Eliot. Gail Levin really know how to start this biography. Listen to this. You are not a woman. You may try, but you can never imagine what it is to have a man's force of genius in you, and yet to suffer the slavery of being a girl. To have a pattern cut out. This is the Jewish woman. This is what you must be. This is what you are wanted for. A woman's heart must be of such a size and no larger, else it must be pressed small like Chinese feet. Oh, what a heartbreaking image. George Eliot, the only adult in Virginia Woolf's very exclusive array. George Eliot really knew how to capture, didn't she, that plight of sexism, the damage that sexism does to women. What a quote to start a biography. And a biography that in particular, of course, is having to find its own place alongside Jack the Dripper, Jackson Pollock, you know, who so overwhelms and bewilders. This is a terrific biography, a really strong feminist portrait of a wonderful mid-20th century artist, Lee Krasner. Fabulous. All right, the last prompt. Your favourite painting? Well, one of my favourite painters, these are all been favourites of mine, but another favourite of mine is the Spanish painter, Joan Miro. I love him to bits. Again, you can see the great theme of today has been the exuberant use of colour and line. He also started out as a realist painter. He went through a strong stage, didn't he, of surrealism and Dada before moving more, I suppose, to more abstract art like this. He loved, I suppose, colour and shape. He was a great user of line and colour. I just love him to bits. He spent a lot of time, of course, also living, didn't he, in Paris. He wanted to be closer to the centre of the art world. But like Picasso, he was a Spaniard, a marvellous painter. I just love him to bits. Here, there's a self-portrait that he did when he was starting out in his more realist phase. Look at this. Oh, boy. You can see the influence here that Miro had on someone like I love so much, like Fred Williams. There's a real influence here. He's just such an important 20th century artist. He had such an impact on so many other artists. Look at that. Whoa. More somber, more dark picture, but again, the use of colour. It's such a well-balanced, dynamic image. And then this, just fabulous. You never get tired of looking at artwork like this, do you? So yes, one of my favourite artists, Joan Miro, the Spaniard. I just love him to bits. But I am also really interested in Dada and Surrealism. But as he went more into the abstract arts, oh boy, he really just took my heart. I love him to bits. All right, the last thing is to tag a few other people. I will tag some people down the bottom. Daniela, the book and art tag. This has been the most wonderful way to celebrate your first year on BookTube. You've got a marvellous channel. I've loved getting to know you via your channel. I love all your videos. You know, Daniela is just so multilingual, moving fluently between particularly English and Italian. I just love that multilingual way of being in the world. It's something that, well, I would love to be, but I don't have that linguist ability, I'm afraid to say. But, oh, Daniela, thank you very much. This has been a joy to take part in. And happy first anniversary on BookTube. Daniela from the Uncommon Reader, the Books and Art tag. Thank you and bye for now.